Hi, this is Dr. Sebastian Rushworth. Welcome to my podcast. My guest today is Dr. Robert Lustig. Robert is an American physician and a pediatric endocrinologist, which means that he's a specialist in hormonal disorders such as type 2 diabetes and obesity. And the purpose of our conversation today is to talk about his recent book, Metabolical, in which he discusses how our modern food environment is harming our health and killing us, and how we've ended up in this strange predicament. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Robert Lustig. Hi, Robert. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
It's my pleasure, Sebastian. Anytime.
So, I want to talk to you about your recent book, Metabolical. What motivated you to write that book?
Well, I wrote my first book in 2013 called Fat Chance. And that book was necessary because the standard mantra amongst the doctors and the nutritionists and, the cognoscente in nutrition was, you are what you eat. Now, I knew that that was not true. I knew that, in fact, you are what you do with what you eat. That what you metabolize is more important than what you consume or the calories that you consume. And so I wrote Fat Chance with that in mind. But in the last 8 years, the information, the data, the paper trail on what the food industry has done to subvert research, to subvert policy, to basically keep us eating crap over the last several decades has come to light. And what I came to realize is that, in fact, in 2013, I got it wrong. What it really should be, the way it should be stated is, you are what they did with what you eat. In fact, the politics is even more important. And so I wrote Metabolical as half science, half expose. If it were a Hollywood tell-all, we'd call it a kiss and tell. But it's about diabetes, so it's more like a piss and tell.
I guess the natural next question then is, what did they do?
What did they do? Well, they did a lot of things.
And who are they, more specifically?
They, the processed food industry, and ultimately government. And while we're at it, we can, talk about big pharma and big medicine. And, I call them all out, throughout the book. What they did was they subverted science, and they did it in several different ways. One way was by, flooding the literature with false data, with industry-sponsored studies that would then make meta-analyses worthless because they would basically come up with, inconclusive. And then they could point to it and say, see, there's no consensus. Another way is by paying off scientists and paying off dieticians, by influencing the public through social media and grassroots campaigns, ultimately by insinuating scientists into positions of policy, especially in other countries, by promoting organizations around the concept of exercise, like in the United States, the Global Energy Balance Network, and ultimately the kicker, spyware, which went on in Mexico, where they actually were tracking the movements of the members of the Institute of Public Health and also El Poder de Consumidor, the activist group trying to get a soda tax realized there. So there's a lot of skullduggery and a lot of stuff the food industry has to answer for. And in Metabolical, I sort of lay out, what their game plan was.
So, and I mean, it's kind of intuitively obvious to me why the pharmaceutical industry does what it does, because, often it's hard to produce really effective drugs. So often drugs are marginally effective or even ineffective, but they still have to do whatever they can to sell them. Why? It's harder to see from the perspective of the food industry. Why do they want to sell us unhealthy foods? Isn't food food? I mean,
oh no, food is not food. I think that's the big issue. And actually, it turns out pharma had its own issues as well in terms of why they do this. And we can talk about both of them separately. Let's stick with food for the moment. Prior to 1975, the annual gross profit margin of the food industry was 1% per year. Now, the increase in population was 1% per year. In other words, the food industry made more money by selling the same amount of food per person to more people. After 1975, the annual profit margin of the food industry was 5% per year. But actually, population increases went down because people weren't having babies. And so the rate of growth of the population actually decreased to an increase of 0.85% per year. So if you're making 5% per year more and the population is going up less than 1% per year, that means that you're selling more food per person to less people in order to be able to make that profit. So the question is, how did they do that? We're supposed to have all of these, homeostatic systems in our body that's supposed to prevent us from being able to overconsume. And for decades, centuries, millennia, they worked pretty well. We discovered this hormone back in 1994 called leptin. And leptin is sort of the, bulwark of this system, because it's the hormone that goes from your fat cells to your brain and tells your brain, hey, I've got enough energy on board. I don't need to eat anymore, and I can burn energy at a normal rate because I am not starving. Well, they figured out how to beat it. They figured out how to basically put that system into a state of suspended animation so it wouldn't work, so that we would keep eating. And the question is, how'd they do that? And I can sum that up in 2 words. The first word is insulin, because insulin blocks leptin. And so when your insulin goes up, your brain doesn't see its leptin. And the second word is sugar, because sugar causes this thing called insulin resistance that basically makes your insulin go up. So by adding sugar to the food, they made us insulin resistant, and in the process, they made us leptin resistant, and so we would keep eating. Now, the question is, what did they know, and when did they know it? And that's what the book lays out. They knew. They didn't know what leptin was, but they knew that they had subverted a satiety signal. And they knew that the more sugar they added, the more we bought. And the reason is because sugar is addictive. And they knew that too. So, they have a lot to answer for. And Metabolical basically, calls them out for it.
So you kind of... you lay the blame for the current epidemic of obesity at the feet of the food manufacturers, and more specifically at the feet of processed foods. And you mentioned sugar. Is it just sugar, or is it something else about processed foods more generally that makes them so unhealthy?
Right. Very good question. So sugar is one of the linchpins in the story, but there's a second linchpin as well, and that is fiber, lack of fiber. in processed food. So people think fiber is what you throw in the garbage can after you juice the fruit. That there's no need for fiber because we don't even metabolize it. We don't even absorb it. So we don't have to worry about it. In fact, our consumption of fiber went from about 50 grams per day at the turn of the 20th century down to about 12 grams per day by, the beginning of the 21st century. So a factor of 4. And people said, well, no one misses it because, after all, we don't metabolize it. It's true. We don't metabolize it. Yet, it is still an essential nutrient, even though the EFSA and the USDA and the medical profession don't consider it an essential nutrient. So why do I consider it an essential nutrient if they don't? And the answer is because the fiber is not an essential nutrient for us. It's essential nutrient for our bacteria, for our microbiome. That's what our microbiome eats. Now, when we eat real food, we feed us and we feed our microbiome. And when our microbiome is happy, we're happy because we're not sick. Problem is you have to feed your microbiome because if you don't feed your microbiome will feed on you. It will actually strip the mucin layer off your intestinal epithelial cells, denuding them. And you can actually see this on electron microscopy, the apposition of the bacteria to the intestinal epithelial cell. And what that does is it causes local inflammation, which causes swelling, which causes the tight junctions that normally hold the intestinal epithelial cells together, presenting a barrier. Because, your intestine's really outside your body. Even though it's inside, it's really outside. Functionally, it's outside. And the intestinal epithelial cells are what basically keep all of the bad things at bay. The full bacteria, the lipopolysaccharides, the cytokines, all the stuff in the, shall we say, the intestinal luminal soup. All that junk that you want to keep going down, and going out your anus. Okay, you don't want it going into your bloodstream. Well, if you denude your intestinal epithelial layer, that stuff's going to reach your bloodstream. It's going to reach your portal vein. The serosa will, basically not be blocked, and all of the stuff will get absorbed, and you will have set up systemic inflammation. You will have set up hepatic inflammation, which leads to hepatic insulin resistance, which leads to chronic metabolic disease and hyperinsulinemia. And then the hyperinsulinemia is going to drive energy into fat cells, and that's going to cause obesity. And the increased insulin is going to then cause a growth paradigm instead of a burning paradigm all throughout the body, including your brain. And now you've got cognition problems as well in terms of, Alzheimer's, in terms of cardiovascular disease because of vascular smooth muscle proliferation, in terms of cancer because of terminal ductive proliferation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the chronic diseases that are going up in our society, and I'll name them for you: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease, are due to defective mitochondrial function, due to microbiome dysfunction, due to processed food. So, the sugar interferes with mitochondrial function. The lack of fiber causes inflammation, which interferes with mitochondrial function. And what you end up with is chronic metabolic disease.
And why exactly do they remove the fiber?
Because you can't freeze it. I'll prove it to you. Take an orange, put it in your freezer overnight, take it out tomorrow, put it on your counter, let it thaw, try to eat it, see what you get. You get mush. Why do you get mush? Because the ice crystals that form macerate the cell wall, allow all the water to rush in, turns it to mush. Now, the food industry knows that. So what do? They squeeze it and freeze it. Now, instead of oranges, now you have frozen concentrated orange juice. You have turned a fruit into a commodity. A commodity is a storable food. You can sell it on the commodities exchange, and you can manipulate the price. And because there's no depreciation, it drives the price down, but the volume goes up, so you still make more money. So ultimately, this is a very good economic maneuver. But from a health standpoint, it's the exact opposite of what we want. And so the food industry profits at our expense.
You have a number of different theses that you repeat again and again in the book. And one of them is this idea that you have to protect the liver and feed the gut. What do you mean by that?
Well, so the liver is your primary detoxification organ. And it works pretty darn well most of the time. All right. But you can overwhelm its capacity. Now, you can overwhelm its capacity with acute toxins like cyanide, sarin, ricin, VX gas, all right, parts per billion, keel over and die on the spot. Or you can overwhelm it with chronic toxins like benzene, carbon tetrachloride, arsenic, tobacco smoke. Okay? Each of these are chronic toxins. They won't kill you with one exposure, but with multiple serial exposures, they will kill you. And not in parts per billion, maybe parts per million or parts per 1,000. Oh, I've left out alcohol off that list, right? I mean, alcohol is 7 calories per gram, but alcohol is a toxin. There's no dietitian who thinks that alcohol is a nutrient just because it has energy, right? So just because something has calories or something has energy doesn't make it a food. Well, it turns out sugar at 4 calories per gram is not a food. It is not a food. So what's the definition of food? I'll give it to you right from the dictionary. Substrate that contributes either to growth or burning of an organism. I think that's a fine definition. Growth or burning. So any given substrate that we take in, that we ingest, that will contribute to either growth or burning, we can call that a food. Does sugar meet either criteria? Does it contribute to burning? It's 4 calories per gram. It should contribute to burning, right? Wrong. Wrong. Because we're not bomb calorimeters. In fact, as I mentioned before, sugar actually inhibits mitochondrial function. The molecule fructose inhibits 3 separate enzymes involved in mitochondrial ATP generation. It inhibits AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is the enzyme that starts chopping up the fatty acids into 2 carbon fragments for beta oxidation. And finally, it inhibits CPT1, carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, which is the enzyme that regenerates carnitine, which is the shuttle mechanism for getting fatty acids into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. So if you inhibit those 3 enzymes, you're inhibiting mitochondria. You're inhibiting ATP generation. You are not contributing to burning. You are inhibiting burning. So, strike one. Now let's take growth. Does sugar contribute to growth? My colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsanigo Ornan, who's the chairman of nutrition at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, has published 3 papers now that actually show that ultra-processed food and sugar in specific inhibit skeletal growth, inhibit cortical bone growth, actually thin the bones, and inhibit elongation. And We also know from other studies that what sugar does is it hijacks growth to go to cancer formation, as we know, say in pancreatic cancer and several other endodermal cancers like breast and prostate and leukemia, etc. And the reason is because those cancers have an enzyme that can actually take fructose and turn it into glucose just for itself, called transketolase. And so it actually hijacks growth away from normal growth. So if a compound does not contribute to burning and inhibits it, and it does not contribute to growth, it inhibits it, is it a food?
I guess not.
I guess not. In fact, sugar, and thereby by proxy ultra-processed food, is not food. It is poison because it inhibits those processes. But unfortunately, that's what the food industry is selling. So we shouldn't be surprised that everyone's getting sick all over the world. So, and what's really amazing is that all you have to do is switch to real food, and all of those chronic metabolic diseases that we've been talking about, they all get better. Now, will they reverse completely? That depends on how long they've been there. So people ask me all the time, well, if I ate a real food diet, would my diabetes go away? And the answer to that question is it depends on how long you've had diabetes. If it's recent, yeah, probably will. If it's been long-term, might be much harder because a lot of those beta cells will become hyalinized and they may not recover. Depends. We see the same thing with a ketogenic diet, with what VertaHealth is doing in terms of basically getting those mitochondria to function properly by running on ketones, because you don't need insulin for that. So, will real food do as well as a ketogenic diet? And the answer is, in most people, yes. But in certain people, they might actually have to go whole hog ketogenic. But the bottom line is, what caused the problem in the first place? Our processed food diet. And that's why type 2 diabetes rates have tripled in the past 20 years, is because of ultra-processed food.
And when you say real food, do you mean that people can really just eat any real foods they want and it's not going to be a problem? You can stuff yourselves with potatoes or with meat or what?
Right. Well, so the question is, what is real food? And the answer is food that came out of the ground, or animals that ate food that came out of the ground. So if you ate potatoes and only potatoes, you wouldn't gain weight. The Irish did that for, 100 years, and they didn't become obese. The fact is, when you eat French fries, we're talking about a different phenomenon, okay? Because now we're not just talking carbohydrate, we're talking fat and carbohydrate at the same time. So there are certain rules to this that you have to keep in mind. You also can't eat just potatoes. You have to have some protein with it because, you need protein for growth too. So it's not like, eat anything you want. But the fact of the matter is, pretty much all real food will contribute appropriately to an insulin response and contribute to satiety, and will then self-limit how much you actually do eat. And so you will keep relatively weight constant, which is how our leptin system is supposed to work. As long as you are insulin sensitive and therefore leptin sensitive, yes, real food will control your weight properly.
So if you're not getting fat from boiled potatoes, but you are getting fat from French fries, is that because the addition of the fat means that the relative proportion of fiber is lower, or what exactly is it in this equation?
So one thing is that the fiber is lower. Also, there are acrylamides that are made when you fry potatoes, carbohydrate in oil, and those acrylamides actually have dietary advanced glycation end products. And there is a receptor in your cells called RAGE, receptor for advanced glycation end products. And when you turn that on, it actually causes mitochondrial dysfunction too. So it's not just what you eat, but how you prepared it that ultimately leads to problems. So there are many, many rules to, quote, real food, because there's also real food preparation that goes into real food.
So, and I guess, I mean, cooking is also a type of processing. So which type of processing is bad and which type is good?
So, and when you cook, there's a chance that you will decompose certain micronutrients, that they will, go bye-bye. That's one of the reasons why the raw, contingent, thinks that, eating raw is so important, and maybe they're right. And it also means that, there's less fiber breakdown because you're eating it raw. So there's a little bit of truth to that. When you cook food that has carbohydrate, you're inducing the Maillard reaction, the browning reaction. That's why we paint barbecue sauce on our ribs, before we put them on the grill. That's why bananas get brown, etc. The bottom line is that process is a normal process in food, but every time it happens, if it's happening inside your cells, it's releasing reactive oxygen species, which then has to be quenched. That was that oxidative stress I mentioned before. And if you don't quench it, then you're going to get cellular dysfunction. And, your mitochondria make reactive oxygen species. And if you actually look at the cell, wherever there are mitochondria, there are peroxisomes right next door. And the reason is because the peroxisomes are there to basically detoxify the reactive oxygen species that the mitochondria made. But what if the peroxisomes aren't working right because you don't have enough antioxidants? Then those reactive oxygen species will make their way to the endoplasmic reticulum, which is where proteins get assembled, and you will engage in a process called the UPR, unfolded protein response, also known as ER stress, endoplasmic reticulum stress. And so you will misfold your insulin molecule. You will misfold your insulin receptor molecule. And now you've got insulin resistance. So it's not just the macronutrients you consume, it's the micronutrients you consume, and whether or not you can detoxify the reactive oxygen species that your cells will make, even if you ate it raw. So there are a lot of rules, and I'm not here to, belabor all the rules. The only thing I'm here to say is that when you eat real food, you're taking care of all the rules at once.
So I guess just a simple rule to live by is that anything that has a long shelf date or anything that contains more than, I say, 5 ingredients, or if people want simple rules to live by, that those are kind of the things they should be going on.
I'll give you an easier one. Any food that has a logo you've heard of, don't buy it. Because if they have a logo and they can afford to pay for a logo and they can afford to pay for advertising, that means they're a processed food company. So, and there are 10 processed food companies that control 90% of the food in the world. And you know who they are. So, that's really where the action is. Real food can't afford a logo. They're not making enough of a profit margin off it to be able to support the advertising to have a logo you've heard of. But that's the food that we all should be eating. Now, people will say, yeah, but that's regressive against the poor, and that's elitist, and not everybody can afford that. And, unfortunately, that's true today. That is true. And I'm not happy about that. The question is, why is ultra-processed food cheaper? Why is that true? And I can sum that up in one word: subsidies. We subsidize all this crap. We subsidize corn, wheat, soy, sugar, specifically to commoditize them in order for the food industry to make more money and for the governments to actually be able to then charge money in tariffs. So the fact that these foods are cheaper is artificial. It's not real. So I personally think that we will not solve this problem until we get rid of food subsidies. There's no economist on the planet that believes in food subsidies anyway, because they distort the market. Let the market work. And would the price of food go up if we got rid of food subsidies? So the Giannini Foundation at UC Berkeley actually modeled this. They did this exercise. They asked the question, would the price of food go up? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. The price of food would not go up, except for two items that would go up. Two: corn and sugar, which are exactly what we want to go up. So for me, this is sort of the linchpin in the story. And until we get rid of food subsidies, we're not going to be able to solve this dichotomy between real food and processed food in terms of price that would then allow for poor people to be able to actually access real food. So this is where I think the rubber hits the road. This is my, what I'm trying to, impress upon governments and trying to fix policy.
And I mean, in a sense, when you say that processed foods are unhealthy, you're not really saying anything controversial. I think most people would probably agree with that. Most politicians would probably agree with that. Why?
Behind closed doors.
Why is it so hard to get governments to fix this problem? Because it sounds like it's quite an easy problem to fix then, in theory. You just get rid of the subsidies.
I couldn't disagree with you more, Sebastian. This is not easy. This is very hard. And one of the reasons it's hard is because all those politicians are being paid off by the food industry, and we have the data to show that. There is, for instance, an organization in America known as the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. And they're top four contributors. What they are is a bill mill. Okay, they write bills and then give them to state houses and Congress, to pass. And they do it on behalf of their patrons. And who are their patrons? Big oil, big pharma, big ag, big sugar. Okay, that's, and big opioids. That was big pharma. Point is, they pay off 338 out of 535 congressmen today. So as long as this is happening, and as long as this is going on, and as long as it's about the money, don't expect anything good to happen. That's the reason why you have to call it out. And you have to shame them. The problem is we have now learned that shaming doesn't seem to do anything anymore.
One of the things you say in the book is that the vegan and the ketogenic communities should stop fighting each other because they basically agree. They're really on the same side. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, all right. So vegans are, plant-based. Ketos are, for the most part, animal-based. I mean, you can be on a plant-based keto diet, but then all you're going to be doing is eating avocados the rest of your life. Animal products, tend to, encompass the majority of the ketogenic diet. So you would say that these two groups should be like diametrically opposite, and they choose to be, and they fight with each other. Something awful. The fact of the matter is that you can do a vegan diet right, or you can do a vegan diet wrong. Because after all, Coke, Doritos, and Oreos are vegan. Or you can do a keto diet right, or you can do a keto diet wrong. Because if you do a keto diet, that's good. And the reason is because, number one, beta-hydroxybutyrate is a signaling molecule, and that's, and it tells your mitochondria to work harder. It activates sirtuins, which are, step on the gas for mitochondria. And also, you're getting insulin way down. And when you get insulin way down, that means your leptin can work. So there are a lot of reasons why ketogenic diet works, except if you take somebody who's on a, shall we say, non-supervised ketogenic diet, just doing it, sort of off the back of the package, and, eating keto cookies, or keto cereal, there's still plenty of carbohydrate in there, and every gram of carbohydrate means you're going to suppress that insulin. And if you're stimulating insulin. My mistake. You're stimulating insulin. And if you're stimulating insulin, then you're not on a keto diet. What you're on is a high-fat, medium-carb diet, which is actually the worst diet. So you can do keto right, or you can do it wrong. You can do vegan right, you can do it wrong. And yes, vegans, when they do it right, it's because there's no sugar in that diet. And keto people, when they do it right, it's because there's no sugar in that diet. So in fact, yes, the substrate is different, but the precept is the same. Get the insulin down. And you can do it either way. So the vegans and the ketos should not be fighting with each other because they actually agree on the basic precept. Get the insulin down. The real enemy of both of them is processed food.
So you talked a bit about that the main solution is to get rid of subsidies. How do we do that? What is the solution to this public health disaster?
Sebastian, if I knew that, we'd already have done it and I'd already win the Nobel Peace Prize. I have no idea. To be honest with you, that is above my pay grade. How do we get rid of subsidies? Wow. We talk with economists who basically, model this and explain to, politicians that this is not helpful, and you have to ultimately bring all the stakeholders to the table so that they can agree. Because right now the food industry is making money hand over fist with the current business model. So in order to do that, in order to get rid of subsidies, the food industry needs a new business model. Well, first they have to recognize that the old business model is not working. Because otherwise, why would they adopt a new one? Well, they're still thinking that they're making money hand over fist. So we have to show them that that's not the case. Ultimately, we have to bring the doctors and the dieticians and the hospitals and the insurers and the politicians and the food industry and by the way, the public to the table in order to basically hack out a completely new food business model that actually works. Now, what do you think the chances of that are?
So we're screwed, basically? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I hope not. I mean, look, hard problems take a long time to fix. I mean, take a look at what goes on in the Middle East. Now let's take a look at what's going on with Russia. I mean, we got big problems. And people are not really worried about food right now. Okay. That ultimately, I think that, food is the biggest problem. It's also the biggest problem for climate change. And we know that, how we process food has a lot to do with what's going on climate change wise. When we re-divert ourselves and, and have, two neurons to rub together to solve this problem, the goal is to bring everyone to the table to address this problem. It is addressable. It can be addressed. Ultimately, the food industry should be rewarded for doing the right thing. They have to see there's money in it for them. And there is. There is money in it for them. I'm not against the food industry making money. I'm for them making money by doing the right thing. Okay? But, making money poisoning people, that's not okay. That's where I get off. And poisoning children, that's not okay.
I think that was an enormous amount of information we went through in less than an hour. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for your excellent book, Metabolical. I've read it twice now, and it has so much valuable information.
I so appreciate that. When physicians read it and comment. I mean, as much as I want the public to understand it, I really want the physicians to understand it. So your, endorsement means a lot. Thank you.
Guess what? What you just listened to was not the full interview. In order to get access to the full-length, uncut version of the interview, you'll need to sign up as a patron, which you can do at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth. Patrons get access to a private podcast feed with full-length versions of all the interviews I do. They also get access to my private forum and all the interesting conversations happening there. And they gain the ability to send me private direct messages. I always respond to messages from my patrons. So please support my work by becoming a patron and signing up at patreon.com/Sebastian Rushworth.